Hello, World Religions class, and welcome to our second week on Christianity. Uh, Hopefully, you had fun with Christianity the first time, Christianity 1, where we covered the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth through roughly the patristic period. So, today we're going to be focusing on the Middle Ages to the present and I'm going to do my very best to cover the broad strokes of what's going on with this religion. Christianity is, in fact, the world's largest religion, with Islam a close second behind it. So, I started this presentation, and if you see the PDF there, with a picture of Jan Hus being burned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 1415. One of the things that I want to make you guys aware of is that within every religion, you're going to have groups who are claiming to be correct, the Orthodox groups, and groups that are basically put on the outside and told that they are not correct. This comes from the Greek word heresis, or chosen, or choice, heretics. So within Christianity, there's always the tension between who's on the inside, Orthodox or right-believing group, and who's not. And in the case of Jan Hus here, he was on the receiving end of the discipline for his claims and he was the Reformation before the Reformation, his beliefs in some of the works that he wrote and some of his preaching in the modern day Bohemia, Moravia, Czech Republic area. So that's my first slide on Christianity too, just to give us a reminder about insiders versus outsiders. And it's always something we have to think about with respect to religion and the logic of what's the logic of burning someone at the stake? Well, the logic is in order to save their soul, you have to burn their body, relax that body to the secular authorities. It's a very interesting concept, but if you get into the logic of Christianity, especially in the Middle Ages and moving forward in the early modern period, it makes a lot of sense based on the supernatural foundations. My next slide is on a totally different take on Christianity that arose in the 18th century. This is the idea of deism. This is the idea that God is a watchmaker God far away. There are certain adjectives we use to describe God in Christianity. In traditional Christian doctrine, God is both transcendent or outside and above, the creator God, but also immanent in the world. So that is a traditional Orthodox belief. God is acting in the world, but God is also the creator of the world. So you've got this dual role of God in the world. But for the deists, God was like a watchmaker, someone who created the universe and then stepped away. This God is transcendent, but not immanent. Now, this is a really important distinction because if you have the idea that God is a creator God that created the universe, but then left it to play by its own rules, it follows then that the way to understand the universe is to explore those rules. And this is where you get the birth of science, the rise of the scientific method to explore nature, experiential philosophies developed out of this during the Enlightenment period. So let's look at experience and use reason to try to understand mechanically how the world works. The world is now a clock, and we are here to understand it, to try to figure out how it plays, what rules it has, and how those rules work for us. And so this is coinciding this view with the rise of modern science. The scientific revolution started in the 17th century, actually the mid-16th century really, but then it really gets cooking with Galileo moving forward, and then the Principia of Newton in 1687. So that is Enlightenment deism, and I put that there because we have these terms, transcendent and immanent. And today, there's this term called secularism. It comes from the Latin word secula, meaning world, but the world that is not the spiritual world. And in our world today, the idea of secularism is that the worldly matters are either indifferent to or reject religion, reject those supernatural foundations. So even in the Enlightenment, you had this attempt to connect with the divinity through transcendence, but no longer immanence. But now you have the idea of secularism, very common today, which is the rejection of both a transcendent God and an immanent God. So these are some interesting distinctions to think about as we move forward. And finally, the next slide to introduce this, actually I have two more slides, is Vatican II, which was a very important ecumenical Catholic council, 1962 to 1965. And the reason I brought this up is because this is how the Catholic Church re-engaged the world after centuries of basically claiming that the findings of science, of Galileo, etc., were just not valid. and this is the church affirming the use of the vernacular among the people. For centuries and centuries, the Latin Mass was in Latin in the West, of course, and the people didn't necessarily always understand what was going on. In fact, most of the time they didn't. Most of medieval Europe was illiterate. And this change to putting the worship service in the vernacular was the Catholic Church sort of re-engaging the world, much like the Protestants had actually done centuries earlier. People like Wycliffe had translated the Bible into English, and then, of course, Luther translates it into German. Through the Reformation, you get people putting the Bible in the words of the people. And this is the Catholic Church putting not only the Bible in the words of the people, but the actual worship services in the words of the people. So Vatican II is an important watershed moment for the Catholic Church, and I wanted to put that there. And finally, I wanted to talk broadly about how architecture reflects religion. And this is an insight that I take from Joseph Campbell, a famous scholar of world mythology. The tallest building in a town or city will often tell you about the ethos of the culture during the time the building was constructed. So in the Middle Ages, the tallest building in a city was almost invariably the cathedral, the seat of church government. Okay, it was often the seat of the bishopric in urban areas, and it was the tallest building. It often took years and years and years, centuries to build. That is spiritual authority. That is the authority of the church in medieval Christendom. And dotted throughout Europe in the landscape, you would see buildings, and the tallest building would always be that cathedral. Well, there's a shift, there's a transition that happens in the early modern period where political authority, the early modern period, by the way, a time of rapid change all across Europe, wars of religion, but you have a shift where some of the new buildings, the tallest buildings, are no longer cathedrals, but they're palaces or government buildings, palazzos, especially in Italy. So you get government buildings that are now the tallest buildings in a city. So you get this shift from spiritual authority to political authority. And one of the important results of the Peace of Westphalia after the 30 Years' War was this idea that you're first a subject to a political dominion first, before religion comes into play. So you get this, religion is being pushed off a little bit here. Your political identity matters more now than your religious identity. And of course, this is also the time when a lot of people are, rebelling against that and leaving places. The Puritans leaving, groups of them leaving, the Pilgrims leaving England and coming over to the New World to establish their own attempt at a theocracy. The Massachusetts Bay Colony for a while there. So finally, let's move on to the tallest buildings today. The tallest buildings today are always skyscrapers, and they're always these seats of economic power. And this, of course, is after the first, second, third, fourth, I think we're in the fourth industrial revolution. The idea that economic power is what is our cultural value right now, is economic power is the most important. We value economics, we value making money, and economic authority is literally visibly represented when you go to cities. The tallest buildings being built are these skyscrapers. It's all about business. It's all about the economy. It's all about goods and services, et cetera, et cetera. And the interesting example that Joseph Campbell gave was Salt Lake City, Utah. And Salt Lake City, Utah was, of course, where the initial followers of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young founded their city. And the very first temple that they built there, and the tallest building for the longest time, was the temple in Salt Lake City. And later, the governor's mansion became the tallest building in Salt Lake City. And still later than that, the Wells Fargo Center is now the tallest building in Salt Lake City. So in the history of Salt Lake City itself, you literally see the shift in the architecture from the tallest building being of spiritual authority, then it being outpaced by the political authority, the building of the governor's mansion, and then finally the building that represents economic authority or power in the Wells Fargo Center in Salt Lake City. So that's an interesting reflection that I really love. I take that from Joseph Campbell. Just gets to thinking about how architecture reflects religion, and in this case, the religion of Christianity. So going back to, let's rewind a little bit. Let's go back to the patristic period. So the patristic period comes to an end around 787 with the Second Nicene Council. That's mostly that's Byzantine more than in the West. It probably comes to an end much sooner than that in the West. Christianity is growing through natural growth and this missionary impulse to spread the euangelion, or the good news, okay, the gospel. An orthodox version of Christianity slowly develops, and it's competing alongside heretics. I talked about this heresis, thing chosen. For example, the Arian Christians taught that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father. This is subordinationism. And they had many converts, especially among the barbarian tribes. And for the longest time, it was unclear which of these groups was going to end up being the one that was the historical winner. It might have been an accident that Clotilda, the wife of Clovis II, or Clovis I, was in fact an Orthodox Christian and not an Arian, that led the Merovingians down this path, and ultimately the Franks themselves and the later Carolingians with Charlemagne. So it was never entirely clear what was going to be the winner, but obviously over time it made that clear. The early Middle Ages had begun in the Latin West by this time, so we're talking between roughly 600 to 1000 BCE. And in the Greek East-speaking parts of the Roman Empire, things go on almost as usual, but now we refer to this Eastern Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire. A lot of people think that the Roman Empire ended in, 476? But that's actually not true. The Roman Empire continued as the Byzantine Empire in the Greek East. So let's talk about statements of belief, creeds. So the word creed comes from the Latin word credo, I believe, and these were written to affirm early Christian beliefs. They began as short recitations of faith, baptismal formulas, and then they later expand as these groups of Christians wanted to self-identify and identify themselves against their enemies or people who do not believe the same as them. And so the Apostles' Creed, the Symbolum Apostolorum, and the Niceno-Constantinopolitan, I never can pronounce that creed, affirm the doctrines of the Trinity. The idea of God the Creator, the belief in Jesus as the Son of God, the Holy Spirit, the death, the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus, the nature of the church, the day of judgment, and that's basically, those are the articles of faith in the Apostles' Creed. So I've got the Apostles' Creed there for you. It's something that I memorized as a child. I remember those days. So let's talk a little bit more about the early Middle Ages. So with the fall of the Rome in the West, competing warlords vied for power in the lands formerly governed by the Roman Empire. I listened to a wonderful hardcore history by Dan Carlin on this, and he likens it to what happens if you've got internet and everything, and then all of a sudden everything goes dark. You don't know no more internet, and then other infrastructure starts to disappear from your life. And that's kind of what it was like during this period of history. The Roman Empire had all this infrastructure. They had aqueducts, baths, roads, all of that infrastructure, and all of a sudden they're gone. Okay, and now you've got competing warlords, and things aren't necessarily going quite as well with respect to economics and livelihood. So over time, and there's a lot of fighting going on between these different barbarian tribes: Franks, Goths, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Picts, Lombards, Vandals, you name it. One group of barbarians, the Franks, Germanic tribe, they established a kind of kingdom over much of northwest Europe. And the founder of the Merovingian dynasty was Clovis, and he united the Frankish tribes, and he sealed alliances with other tribes to have some sort of stability in that part of Europe. And that was around 500 or so. Later, another family came to power among the Franks, and this was the Carolingians. And the most famous of them was Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, Karl der Grosse, who lived from 742 to 814 of the Common Era. He was known by a number of titles. In fact, Holy Roman Emperor was his last one. There was a little trick played on him by Pope Leo III, crowning him the new Emperor of the Romans. You'll see that there. Charlemagne is not really that interested in titles. He's much more of just a day-to-day ruler guy. He's actually a brilliant administrator, despite the fact that he was illiterate. He was interested in establishing education and making things better. But he himself did not have some of the skills that many of the people around him did. But he was an excellent administrator and an excellent warlord. And, there's all sorts of theories about how this went down and the Pope springing this crown on him. Well, what does this mean? Well, if the Pope is crowning the king, that symbolizes that spiritual authority grants the secular or the temporal power to the king. And kings, of course, generally don't like this. They don't like being second behind anybody. And this is going to set up clashes throughout the rest of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period between popes and kings of these different emerging kingdoms and later nation states. So that's a theme that is going to continue. The church, what does the church do? Well, the church does something quite brilliant, in fact. The church takes over the infrastructure left behind by the Romans. And they're turning old judicial buildings, basilicas, into churches. Basilicas actually are Roman legal courts, and now they're turned into church buildings. You've got all the infrastructure taken over. The idea of a diocese, that's a Roman administrative unit, and now it's being taken over by the Roman Catholic Church to have bishops overseeing a certain area of land in the western part of the Roman Empire. So the Catholic Church is adapting to these changes by taking over this Roman infrastructure, and they're providing stability for the people, much more than the competing warlords are doing at this time. At the same time, you have the rise of Cenobitic monasticism. This is where monks come together. They lead an ascetic lifestyle, but they come together in service of the Lord. But they live in monasteries. They have a leader called an abbot. And Cenobitic monasticism becomes the dominant form of religious life. Sure, there are priests, of course, and bishops, but monks, monasticism really takes off. Benedict of Nursia, for example, he lives from 480 to 547 CE. He really is seen as the founder of Cenobitic monasticism. There's the famous monastery that he found in Monte Cassino in Italy. And then there's later Benedictine monasteries that come later in history, including the famous one in Cluny in France. So monasticism becomes hugely important, not only because it's providing an outlet for spirituality, but also because it is basically the repository of learning. Monks are copying books and keeping intellectual culture alive in libraries, copying, and in the scriptorium, and basically having the religious life that way. And so we owe a lot to the monks of Western Europe for keeping many of the manuscripts and the writings from the Greco-Roman classical past alive. They didn't have all of them. And it's funny. People think that we've always had access to Plato and Aristotle. Nah, we lost access to those guys for a while. I think for a long time, like the Timaeus might have been one of the few that they knew from Plato. The rest of it they got through some others. Aristotle didn't have much of him. Aristotle comes back to the West later in the 11th century, 12th century. So we've got some interesting stuff going on there. I love it. All right. So early Middle Ages, a lot of people call this the Dark Ages. And people have been arguing about this for the longest time. Was this a Dark Ages? Well, if you look at standard of living, probably, but not in all places. It's tough to generalize about all of Western Europe, which is the focus that I'm taking here. And of course, we still got the Byzantines in the Greek East doing their thing. But it's really interesting that this Dark Ages corresponds roughly with the rise of a new religion in East, Islam. And the economics of the time are the agricultural form of manorialism and feudalism. You have king, knight, or lord, knight, peasants. The peasants work the land, the knights protect the peasants. And the king or the lord has the manor, and everybody just sort of has this relationship. And trust me, being a peasant is tough, but at least you've got some sort of semblance of normalcy with protection. And being a knight, you're wealthy enough to have your own armor. If the Lord calls upon you to go fight another warlord, that's part of your job. So you've got this economic thing called manorialism and the political variant of this feudalism. And you've got this new religion in the East that has actually started to displace people from North Africa and Asia. And in the 7th century, most of Spain is actually lost to Islam. And the struggles between Christians and Muslims happen all throughout the Middle Ages. And these include, of course, the Crusades, as well as the Spanish Reconquista, which dates from about 718 and a series of, pushing back up against trying to go into the Iberian Peninsula between 718 and 1492. 1492, very famous year. And, of course, we also have the Ottoman Turks later, who are one of the few Muslim groups to arise from the ashes of what's left behind after the Mongols get to many of the caliphates and kingdoms in Asia and Central Asia. And so the Ottoman Turks almost take Vienna in 1529. So there's always going to be this tension between Christians and Muslims during this time period where the Christians want to go back and retake the Holy Land and they are repelled. Or, the Muslims want to maintain an area and the Christians want them out. So there's a lot of back and forth going on throughout these medieval centuries here. The Golden Age of Islam, which we'll talk more about next week, is basically from the Abbasid Caliphate from the 8th century, I believe 758, until, I think I said 758 possibly, until the Mongol invasions of Baghdad. So the Mongols really sort of brought an end to the golden age of Islam, and this roughly corresponds to most of what we call the Dark Ages in medieval Europe. Although the Dark Ages, technically, scholars tend to say that it ends around 1000 of the Common Era. All right, so Christianity in the West really starts to take off in the next period, which is called the High Middle Ages. And that's from about 1000 to 1300. And as kingdoms established themselves, England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, sort of holding together these Germanic principalities, they're establishing themselves, and they have sometimes very tenuous, sometimes good relationships, sometimes bad relationships with the popes. And the popes, by the way, in the Middle Ages are becoming increasingly powerful, increasingly large landowners, and urban centers begin to develop. So we get the urbanization of Europe happening during this period. Paris, Bologna, Cologne are early places of where universities are transformed out of what are called cathedral schools. Okay, the queen of the sciences is theology. And the University of Paris, which is founded in 1150, becomes like the most renowned school. I often joke that if I had been born in the Middle Ages, my undergraduate degree would have been the Queen of the Sciences, because I did, in fact, major in theology. I was just a few centuries late. Eventually, more subjects are added to the curricula of these schools, so you get what looks more like a traditional paths. You can study law, medicine, philosophy. So this is also the time when more forms of the religious life emerged. So you get the mendicant or beggar movements that begin, the Franciscans in 1209, the Dominicans, the Order of Preachers in 1216. And they re-energize religious life, and they offer the ascetic life in new ways, and they add to the ever-growing sort of monastic movement and quasi-monastic movement. So remember, in the early church, people witnessed to their faith by martyrdom. Right, because Christianity was not a legal religion in the Roman Empire. People expressing their faith through these ascetic means and having these conversion and spiritual experiences, this continues, and it really takes place. Martyrs end up, now you've got these Anchoritic and Cenobitic monks, and now you've got these mendicant movements. So you've got different and new forms of the ascetic religious life that is forming. And if you look at the religions we've studied, you've got all of these within all the different various religions. You've got people who want to express their spirituality in more or less that fashion. And of course, when we studied Buddhism, Buddha had this, lavish lifestyle, and then he went really, really far into the asceticism, and then he found a middle way. So you see this literally all in the life of Buddha, but within all the religions that we study, there's always going to be people who are going to want to express their faith in ways that others might not, with respect to, how devout they're going to show their religion and how they're going to express that to the world. Slowly, something like a middle class was emerging in the cities, although the agricultural manorial system remained dominant. This is the time when, still the time when local priests are not very well educated. The education system is starting, but you still have priests that are not very well educated. Latin is the language of worship, and sometimes priests may just know the worship service, had memorized the Latin, but not really know it that well. You're not really doing worship in the vernacular language of the people. And so that's going to be an issue that's going to come back, and it's going to come back in a big way in the late Middle Ages, because literacy is going to be on the rise, and people are going to want more access to the texts of their religion. All right. I wanted to talk again about architecture. I love talking about architecture and, of course, Gothic architecture. The great medieval cathedrals that arose over the urban landscapes symbolize the growing wealth and power of the church. It became the largest landowner in Europe by the High Middle Ages. For example, Notre Dame Cathedral took 182 years to build between 1163 and 1345, and it is often seen as a symbol of the Christian faith in Europe. I know that a lot of people remember the burning of the cathedral. I don't remember when, it was a year or two ago, maybe longer than that. But a lot of people, there was a lot of discussion about what this means for Europe. So it just goes to show how iconic certain buildings are to different faiths. So, for example, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that's another really important one. The Vatican in Italy, of course, another one. The architecture of the time features high ceilings, stained glass windows, oftentimes these rose windows, and flying buttresses to support the weight of the high walls. So this is actually a transition from the earlier architecture, which had much thicker walls and smaller windows, called Romanesque. And the name Gothic wasn't used at the time. It was actually a pejorative term that later Renaissance thinkers applied to it. Oh, that's Gothic. It's barbarian, because the Goths are, the classic barbarian tribal people. Ostrogoths, Visigoths, the Goths. Looking at this barbarous architecture because it's not the Greco-Roman classical ideals, right? So you have people literally later in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and early modern period who are looking back and saying, oh, that's just barbarian architecture. We're recovering the really, really good stuff, the rebirth of the Greco-Roman models from the ancient days of Greece and Rome. All right. So what are some medieval trends? Well, one of them is a style of education, a very logical, step-by-step method of talking about all sorts of different questions and trying to answer questions. It's called scholasticism. And as the Middle Ages wore on, you have theologians like Anselm of Canterbury, Peter Lombard, Peter Abelard, Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, one of my favorites, William of Ockham, and others. They pursue a style of education known as scholasticism, and this is taking place at the same time as the recovery of Aristotle. And this led to new systems of Christian theology that work to reconcile Aristotle with traditional Christian doctrine. This is incredibly important, especially in the work of Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica and Summa Contra Gentiles. He writes 5 proofs for the existence of God. He pulls upon Aristotle's idea of the unmoved mover to talk about, creation from nothing, creatio ex nihilo. And there is this attempt to fuse Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology and revelation. And it's a fascinating study because Thomas Aquinas and others become hugely influential in the way the Catholic Church understands itself in the early modern and modern periods. Thomas Aquinas stands out as one of he's probably the most prominent Roman Catholic theologian ever. And that's coming from someone who loves Augustine of Hippo. Another really important medieval trend that's going on right now is what's going on with the sacraments. What's going on with these things that are part of our ritual, daily, monthly, daily, weekly, monthly, annual lives. So the sacraments are becoming much more fully developed. The sacrament of penance especially, you've got contrition, feeling sorry, confessing your sins, receiving your penance, and then being absolved of your sins by the priest through this process that's developing, okay? This is developing in the Middle Ages, and penance becomes really, really important for making sure that you are doing what needs to be done to stay on the right hand of your, on the correct side of your God. Remember, this gets to the fundamentals of religion. People want to be on the right side, and they want their God to be happy with them. And the sacrament of penance puts you back in the good place with God, so that you can, as this develops, spend less years in purgatory and go to heaven. Because remember, there's the heaven and then there's hell, and these develop within Christianity as the years go on in the patristic period, and it's pretty well developed by the time you get to the Middle Ages. Other sacraments include, of course, the big two, baptism and the Eucharist, confirmation, holy orders, marriage, and anointing of the sick. So you've got 7 sacraments total, and of course the big two are baptism and the Eucharist, but penance takes on a huge role here. There's also new traditions that have started to develop over time. And some of them are extra biblical, which means they're not necessarily in the Bible, but they become part of what the church is and what the church does. And the veneration of the saints is a big part of this, the idea of relics and holding on to, and there's some sort of spiritual power attached to relics, and especially from saints, people who have lived holy lives. And so the veneration of saints within Christianity becomes a big deal, because Christianity and most religions on a practical lived level among people takes on a tactile experiential form that doesn't necessarily equate to what's actually written in the spiritual texts themselves. So the veneration of the saints is going to be hugely important later on when others reject this. The rejection of the veneration of saints and relics is actually a huge part of the Protestant Reformation that comes later. You also get the establishment of new doctrines. So, for example, the idea of transubstantiation, which is the miraculous, how do we understand the miraculous transformation of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ? So that is explained through the doctrine of transubstantiation, and the language actually is taken from Aristotle, the idea of a substance and its accidents. I'm not going to go into detail there, but it's a really interesting way that the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, how they managed to describe this miracle that takes place during the words of institution. Hoc est corpus meum, okay? This is my body. The church also established a position on purgatory at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. This is interesting because purgatory doesn't seem, others are going to argue later on that there's no real biblical reference for this. There may be a passage in Matthew, I believe, that supports some kind of vision of what purgatory is, which I call the waiting room to heaven. But this idea of purgatory actually gets really well developed in a literary fashion by Dante Alighieri in his Divine Comedy. So you have first the Inferno, then the Purgatorio, and then, of course, the Paradiso. So this is another newish kind of tradition that gets connected to Christianity as it's moving through time. And this is, of course, perfectly natural. Religions pick up traditions and pick up things that aren't necessarily there in the beginning, but they become part of the tradition moving forward. This is going to be a huge deal for people later on who want the church to return back to its roots. So let's talk about the late Middle Ages. So the late Middle Ages happens between roughly 1300 and 1500. And it's a time of rapid growth in urban centers. It's also a time of either growing corruption in the church or more people paying attention and being aware of the corruption in the church. It could be probably both, but just because something's there and nobody reports it, nobody's going to know. So it made that people are just becoming more aware of it, but corruption in the church. This is going to become a huge issue later on, and I'm going to give you some examples of what happened to sort of demonstrate the problem that's going on at the higher levels. The first one is the Babylonian captivity, is what it's called. It's a period when the papacy moved from Rome to a place, Avignon, in France, between 1306 and 1378. Had a lot more to do with politics than with religion, with Italian warring families, okay? And it was followed by what's called the Western Schism, a time of rival popes in Avignon and Rome between 1378 and 1418, only to be ended at the Council of Constance. This is where you literally have popes and anti-popes. And church historians and scholars in the church itself had to look and say, okay, who's the real pope, who's not the real pope? So this is a huge black eye on the public image of the church, to have these warring popes, and you have people all around Europe, and you have, I believe it was Marsilius of Padua who comments on this, and others. There's just a lot of problems, and people are starting to really try to re-understand what the Corpus Christianorum is, what the body of Christ is, Corpus Christi, what the body of Christ is, okay? What does this mean to be the church? And how is the papacy involved? And actually, Council of Constance and some other councils in the 15th century try to establish a new way to have authority called conciliarism, which ultimately gets squashed later on in the 16th century. So there's actually attempts to make the church a bit more democratic, or at least look to the power of the councils instead of the popes. But at this time in the 14th century, this is a huge black eye on the church, okay? There's also a lot of reform movements springing up at this time. I'll give you an example. One of them in the Netherlands is called the Brethren of the Common Life, which is kind of a quasi-monastic movement. There's also reformers within these different movements springing up, writers, devotional writers. For example, one of the most famous is someone who's part of this Brethren of the Common Life, Thomas à Kempis, who writes The Imitation of Christ, really a sacramental devotion. So between like 1418 and 1427. The Imitation of Christ is one of the most famous and popular and most read Christian devotionals of all time. So after the Bible, you're going to have to look to The Imitation of Christ, Imitatio Christi. So there are people writing devotionals. Like, the devotionals are a huge part of any religion, but it becomes a big deal because people really want to reconnect with their faith in a time when the upper echelons of the church are clearly showing corruption and what they consider decay. You also have others who want to return Christianity to its biblical foundations. And there are some important reformers here. One of them is John Wycliffe, who was part of a group called the Lollards. And he translated the Bible with a group of people. He translated it into English between 1382 and 1395. And some are into doing that as well, but they also want to re-understand exactly what it means to be a part of the church. What does it mean to be elect or chosen as a part of the church? And what does it mean? What sacraments really are a part of that? What is, like, how are you going to judge who is a true Christian? Because it clearly, can you do it based on behavior? I mean, is there some sort of ethical norm that we can judge? Or is it something you can't do it on the basis of behavior? Like, the visibility of who's saved and who's not becomes a huge problem for these people. And this is especially the case with this reformer I'm talking about here, John Huss. Because John Huss his reform movement in what is now the Czech Republic, Bohemia, and Moravia is actually a Reformation before the Reformation. And what you've got is the sort of Orthodox group that comes from this, the Utraquists, which is from the Latin sub utraque specie, which means under both kinds. And that means that they're taking communion under both kinds, as they see in the biblical precepts, not only just one of them, as had always been the case in the Roman Church, okay, leading up to this, okay? So they're taking both the body and the blood of Christ. And you've got different splinter groups that come from within this. You have like an entire war, the Hussite wars that happened in the mid-15th century because of this Reformation before the Reformation. And so they're all trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a true Christian? Like, what is it, your behavior? Is it that you're a part of the church, or like claim to be part of the church? Like, what does it mean to be a true Christian if, you know, who's claiming to be the head of the church is they're not really leading at all? So it becomes a real issue, the visibility of who's saved and who's not. And this is going to show up again in the Reformation later. Yeah, so I list some church abuses here. Pluralism, a bishop having two or more bishoprics, oftentimes purchased, and that's simony, of course. Simony goes back to Simon Magus in the New Testament, trying to buy a church office. Absenteeism, if you're in one place, in one bishopric, you can't be another. This became a major problem for Martin Luther and others at the time of the 95 Theses. Nepotism, of course, basically choosing, you know, allies and friends for posts. That is a common human moment of corruption there. And, of course, immorality among the clergy. This was the time of what we call like the Renaissance warrior popes during this 14th century time period leading up to the Reformation. So it's a really fascinating time period. It's you find a lot of the really interesting stuff on the ground with people like Thomas à Kempis, John Huss, Wycliffe, and others. You find that these people are clearly getting much more educated and aware of what's going on. They really want to change the church. And the really, what I'm going to talk about next is like, well, I'll get to it in a minute. I do want to talk about something that's actually particularly relevant to our time now. I want to talk about the Black Death, the bubonic plague. So the reason I'm talking about this is obvious with COVID-19, but the bubonic plague killed between 75 and 200 million people in Europe, Asia, and North Africa between 1347 and 1352. And it remains the most deadly pandemic in history, and having killed at least 30% of Europe's population, with some estimates of over 50%. I was looking around today. I gave up on trying to come up with a consensus because there is no consensus there. So I'm going to say like major, 30 to 60%. Like that's a pretty broad swath, but 30% is quite a bit. That's a bit close to a third. This was so bad that it took 200 years for the population levels to recover. Okay, so what does this mean for the people, and what does it mean for their faith on the ground? Okay, and this gets to the study of religion in general and how people react to misfortune, negative just horrific things that happen. And many people across Europe scapegoated already marginalized groups, including Jews, foreigners, beggars, lepers. They're asking, why is God punishing the people? And they're basically blaming others for bringing this trouble to them. Remember, the idea of Christendom that had developed over the Middle Ages was that this was a Christian world. And marginalized groups, small, they're allowed to sort of, exist as long as everything works out. But when trouble comes, this is a sign that God is unhappy. This is an attitude that's going to continue happening. It actually continues to this day with some very evangelical Christian groups, where misfortunes in a country, in a realm, are seen as evidence of God's displeasure with that realm for tolerating, putting up with religious minorities that pollute, that do not share the same belief, and therefore sort of pollute the spiritual, I guess you could call it the spiritual mojo of the area, right? And so why is God punishing the people? And it's because of you. It's because you don't believe with us, and because God wants all of us to believe. Like, how can we all be saved if you and your marginalized community there is not with us? So this is very sort of, when disaster strikes, people tend to really sort of get back to their identity politics. We are correct. We need to get back on the right path, and we're going to lash out at people who aren't with us. I actually just said the word disaster. The word disaster literally means ill-starred, dis and asteria, the astro, that root. Um, as if the stars governed our fates, a disaster, right? So people are making astrological explanations. People are also deciding that how are we going to get God's forgiveness? So the flagellants, for example, groups of people across much of continental Europe, whipping themselves on the back to show penance, to show that they are sorry for their sins and the corporate sins of the community of the body of Christ throughout Europe, because they want this to stop. So the Black Death, really, really, really very important part of the late Middle Ages, because what you have is, well, I'll talk about it in a minute here, but you have changes that take place, and a lot of it has to do with population loss. So let's talk about some late medieval trends. I've mentioned them already. Anti-clericalism. People are becoming satisfied with the state of an increasingly corrupt church. Now, is it that the church is more corrupt or that people are more aware? That's, chicken and the egg argument. Which one is it? A growing middle class. You have an unintended consequence of the Black Death was that now you have a shortage of labor, and laborers could now demand higher wages. They're much more in demand now because there are fewer of them. To keep tenants, lords often shifted to rent payments and away from labor services. Feudalism was on the way out. Okay? And this is interesting too, because you do get a lot of peasant revolts that start happening in the late Middle Ages. One of the most famous one was in 1524, 1525, the German Peasants' War. And you get a lot of peasants revolting and demanding changes in the way things are run and all their privileges and rights. And it's a really complicated political situation, but the general trend is away from this old feudal idea and into what we would consider something closer to a growing middle class and people basically being paid for their services. It's a very slow and painful shift. You have knights by the 16th and 17th century who are no more than robber barons with just titles. You have old money that's not, they're old, like the new money, the nouveau riche, like they're the ones sort of making the changes, new banking families, etc., especially in Southern Europe, places like Italy. But you've got, I'm mindful of Miguel Cervantes of Don Quixote, and about how this character longs for the days of, knighthood and chivalry. But those days are done by the time you get to the late 16th century. And that process starts happening here in the late Middle Ages with the consequences from the Black Death. The biggest change that I think happened during this time period, as a part of all of this, to just make everything just that much more exciting as you get into the early modern period, which is my absolute favorite time period in history, is the invention of movable type and the printing press in the West by Johannes Gutenberg, roughly 1450, 1440s, 1450s. This invention changed everything. Why? Books could be produced and consumed for far less cost. Pamphlets. This is the age when you start getting the first woodblock prints and like propaganda, cartoons, etc. during this time period. Before, monks are copying books in the scriptorium. It's a time-consuming process. They're doing it on vellum. There's monks who do the writing, and then there's monks who do the illuminating or the illustrating. The only people who could really afford books in the Middle Ages are the wealthy, the aristocracy. And the people on the ground are mostly illiterate. They don't have access, and they don't have access to books, and they don't learn. What they learn from when they go to church, and they don't even know that much because it's in Latin. It's not in the language that they know, especially those parts in the Mass. So now, all of a sudden, you've got this invention that enables you to print books and other items at far less cost, and print is becoming much more available to the people. So what you're going to see is you're going to get a rise in literacy. Early on, actually, in the Reformation, mostly in Protestant areas, but then the Catholic areas start to catch up later. But you get a rise in literacy, and especially among the Protestant traditions that come up later. I mean, you have places like Massachusetts Bay Colony where you may have had like 99% literacy rates, which is crazy when you think about it. But if you think about just how biblical some of these Protestant religions are on the basis of Luther's idea of sola scriptura, or going back to the scriptures, that literacy is like fundamental to how they express their faith, reading the Bible on a daily basis. So the printing press changed everything. I think of the three most important inventions in history, and I put it this way: the wheel, then the printing press, and then the World Wide Web. That is, you can argue with me, but those are my big three. And the printing press changed everything. Finally, we do have to be mindful that Columbus and the discovery or the rediscovery actually wasn't a discovery at all. They had always been there, but now the Europeans and Asians and North Africans have a new place to go to look for resources, etc. So this is the emerging of the colonial era in the early modern period, and for all the negatives and positives that brings, and that's 1492. That's also when the Moors are finally expelled from Granada in Spain. So 1492, we have to remember this is a huge shift as well. Oh my God! Now there's another part of the planet that we are now becoming familiar with. So this is a time of a lot of change. I mean, I even talked about Copernicus and Galileo and the geocentric versus heliocentric views of the universe. All right, so let's talk about the Reformation. And I'm going to do my best to keep this short and sweet. The Reformation begins, people say it begins on October 31st, 1517, when Martin Luther posts the 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church to protest the sale of indulgences in Ducal Saxony. He lives in another part of Saxony, Electoral Saxony, under a prince named Frederick the Wise. He's a teacher at the local university there. And I could go on and on about this guy's story. It's amazing. He studies to be a lawyer, but he has some kind of conversion experience where he says, I'm going to help me St. Anne, I will become a monk. He becomes a monk. He becomes roughly what we would call like a professor of Old Testament. He's a whiz with languages. He is kind of belligerent. He's the kind of the guy they say did theology with a hammer. So Martin Luther, by this time, and he also is extremely pious. He suffers what people, Reformation scholars would call his case of the scruples, where he also always feels like he's doing something wrong, and he wants to be on the right side of God. His confessor, Johann von Staupitz, had major issues with him on this. But he is the most Protestant person, a prominent person that arises during this time to protest and go against the ways of the Catholic Church at this time. And he becomes the first what we call Protestant reformers. And he protests the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences has to do with the medieval penitential system and the idea of paying money to draw upon the treasury of merits to help loved ones get out of purgatory early. And this was seen as an abuse, which it most assuredly was. Actually, the Catholic Church reformed that later. Basically, Luther is saying that this is not the way things work. And it wasn't just about penance or indulgences. It was more about how people are saved by God. And Luther looked at the entire Catholic sacramental system and said, this is all wrong. And that really, really, really put him on the wrong side of the church. This is like, in the early 1520s, he wrote a series of reforming treatises, Pagan Servitude of the Church, otherwise known as the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, The Freedom of the Will. And he basically lays out that the church is wrong about the way they think about salvation, that you are saved by faith through grace, or by grace through faith, and not by any works that you do. He completely rejects the sacrament of private penance. He keeps what's called corporate confession, but he rejects the idea that all these other sacraments matter. He keeps baptism and the Eucharist because they're biblical, and he rejects the rest, and he basically says that you're not saved because you go through this process throughout your life of doing penance and getting back on the good side of God and working towards some sort of level where you can go to purgatory for a while, and then ultimately after thousands of years of being purged of your sins, you can emerge pure and attain the vision of God, right? The Visio Dei, in that sense, he doesn't see anything about the Christian message that supports that, and he's looking at the Pauline epistles and different authors from the patristic period, most notably Augustine, where he comes up with this idea that you are saved by grace through faith, through election. And I could go much more deep into that, but basically it's the idea that nothing you do saves you. God saves you. It's like snow on a dunghill. You are never going to be able to purify yourself through any human effort at all to make yourself ready to see the vision of God. The only thing that can do that is Christ's grace. Christ makes you holy by covering up your sins and making you appear holy. It's called forensic justification, legal justification. So you are claimed to be and shown to be holy, not through any work of your own, but because Christ saves you. So this return to what Luther considered the more primitive version of salvation. Remember, he doesn't think he's doing anything new. He thinks he's going back to the old ways, right? And scholars have argued about that ever since. And so what Luther does is basically reject fundamentally the Roman Catholic theology of his time. So what started out as a debate about indulgences ultimately became how you understand your relationship with God and salvation. Is it some sort of process through which you work through your life as you go through the mediators, the priestly class within that system? Or is it a much more immediate sort of personal relationship and mediated, of course, through the signs of your faith that are going to show up by going to church and being a good person, these things. And remember, this is about the visibility. How are you known as a Christian? This is going to become a huge problem for the Protestants because what does it mean to be the elect? And how is that known? I'm not going to give you any major answers here, but Luther is the one that sort of really transforms the way later Protestants are going to think about salvation and their relationship to the church. So for the Catholics, ecclesiology becomes and remains the major component or the major theological subset of the belief system because salvation is mediated through the church. Within Protestantism, that's not necessarily the case. It's really about soteriology, or about how you achieve salvation. And this is going to, of course, turn into a much more individualistic turn as Protestantism moves into the Enlightenment and Romantic periods. So Luther's breakthrough here, the Reformation breakthrough based on his readings of Romans, Galatians, and of course other Pauline epistles and Augustine and others, is going to take him down a different path. And you're going to have the first major split since 1054 when the Orthodox broke off with the Roman Catholic Church, mostly on linguistic grounds and a few doctrinal issues. We have to remember, though, Luther did not want to start something new, but he ultimately did. There's a famous moment, here I stand, I could do no other. There are 3 Latin phrases I put on the PowerPoint for you. Sola Scriptura, the idea that you go to Scripture alone. Luther wanted to completely purge all of these extra biblical traditions, like the veneration of the saints, out. Relics, gone. Purgatory, what? No, he didn't want any of that anymore. Like, Luther was not about that. He actually married a former nun, Catherine von Bora. Okay, and he was a former monk. He was actually an Augustinian monk. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the Reformation. 2 other important reformers included Huldrych Zwingli and John Calvin. There are many more, but those are the 2 most important besides Luther. Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, final edition, 1559. The first edition actually came out in 1536. This was the first really sort of systematic theology, and it followed up on the logic of Luther's doctrine of predestination. Doctrine of justification. Well, getting ahead of myself there. Calvin's main tenets are going to be summarized by this acronym called TULIP, and I'll get to that in a second. But Calvin is what we call a second-generation reformer, and he is most active in a place called Geneva, Switzerland, where they established a kind of theocracy for a time, he and his main follower, Heinrich Bullinger. And I'm starting to throw around the word Protestant. Where does this word come from? Well, there was an initial moment in like the mid-1520s when the empire was like, all right, we'll see what happens. But by 1529, they're like, no, we can't have any more of this spread of Lutheranism. The German peasants' revolt had happened. No more of this. So by 1529, there was a meeting at a place called Speyer, and a group of princes protested against the conclusions here, which is you got to go back to the church or else. And they protested, and they became known as Protestants. So that's where we get the word Protestant from. And Calvin, of course, is working in the aftermath of this, mostly 1540s, 1550s there. And his theology can be summarized by an acronym called TULIP. And I think someone in the mid-20th century, early 20th century did this. And this is the working out of the logic of Luther's idea of justification into all the different areas of Christian theology. So the first is total depravity, original sin. We are born and completely turned away from God. That's T. U is unconditional election. God chooses who God chooses unconditionally, regardless of merit or whatever, to be saved or not saved, elect or not elect. Limited atonement. Okay. I wish I remembered more about that one right now, but I don't. Please look that one up. Irresistible grace. You cannot resist God's grace. When God turns your soul, when God turns you through the sacraments, through that process, well, not really a process. That's the weird thing about Protestantism. Is it a process or is it not? How do we understand this? It's irresistible. And as an elect person, P, perseverance of the saints. So you will persevere in your faith. You will not fall away. Calvin was actually particularly influential among English Puritans. The Reformed Church is primarily from him as well. And hence the Congregationalists that immigrated to the New World were very, very influenced by John Calvin's variant of Christianity, as they were sort of a subset of the Anglican Church that really had a sort of a Calvinist streak. The Protestants rejected all but 2 of the 7 sacraments, and they rejected the Catholic penitential system. Moreover, they inspired other groups to reject the Catholic Church, including the Anabaptists and Spiritualists. I happen to have studied a lot about the Anabaptists. It comes from the Greek words anabaptizo, which means to baptize again. It's a pejorative term used against them by their enemies. These were actually a group of Christians living in Switzerland. It started around in the Swiss cantons in that time period in the 1520s, where a group of Christians were like, you know what? Baptism was never of children in the Bible. There might be some mention of something, but it's adults. And so their claim was that you had to be an adult and choose the life of whatever it was going to be, suffering perhaps, at the hands of the world. You had to choose to be a Christian. And Conrad Grebel and others held the first baptism, what they considered the actual baptism, and they became known as Anabaptists or Rebaptizer, Wiedertaufe in German. And this group of people, there was sort of this branching out and spread of this group as well, and they were always a small minority group, but they actually have managed to persist to this day in the group known as the Mennonites, also the Amish and the Hutterites, as a distinct branch within Christendom. They're known as the Peace Churches. And there's some other subgroups in there as well, as the German Brethren and the Quakers. But this group of Christians also came out of the Reformation because they thought that Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin were not taking the Reformation far enough. And they actually wanted to take it further. And they actually became a much persecuted, maligned group throughout the early modern period, particularly the 1530s and 40s. And they put together their own sort of ideas about, what it means to be a true Christian and who's part of the true church. They saw the alliance of political power with the church, as expressed in Roman Catholics and Protestants by local princes. They saw that as a perversion of the devil, because for them, the early church was never allied with the political authorities. They called it the sort of the Constantinian alliance, and that was a no-no for them. They always had to be a people separate from the world. And this, of course, is expressed today with the Amish and other groups who, it's almost like there was a snapshot at a time when they decided to make sure that they maintained a set of standards and beliefs and the way they approach the world. Some Amish and other Peace Church groups, have made modifications to their way of life, but others have not. I mean, some Amish are still going around with horse and buggy because it's an important part of their tradition. This is because this is the fundamental of the nature of their conviction that you are separate from the world. So those groups, the Anabaptist groups, are particularly interesting to me. The Peace Churches, as they're known, and I have a lot of enduring respect for them. My dissertation was actually mostly about the Catholic priests that actually despised and hated them, and actually connected them and Luther and others to all of the former heresies that had been, of course, defeated and destroyed by the Catholic Church. So, of course, these Catholic priests in the later 16th century and early 17th century are like, we've dealt with this before. Why are these people still here? The reason we've got the Ottoman Turks over here in, Central and East Europe is because of them. This goes back to the plague issue as well. All right, so let's talk about the Counter-Reformation and the Catholic Reformation. Well, I just mentioned 2 priests. One of them's name was Christoph Erhard. The other was Christoph Andreas Fischer. Very minor characters in this story. But the Counter-Reformation happens because different regions across Europe are falling to Protestant influences. And of course, I mentioned the Protestants mobilized very quickly with the printing press. And so different regions are falling to Protestantism. So the Catholic Church has to do two things. One, they have to reform themselves. And so that becomes known as the Catholic Reformation, when they start reforming themselves, cleaning up abuses such as simony, pluralism, absenteeism, nepotism, etc. But they're also fighting back against the Protestants by sending missionaries and preachers to go and try to convert the aristocracy, especially the aristocracy, back. Why are they going to aristocrats and local lords? Well, because there had been this, this is going to be an early modern thing, where whatever the lord's religion is, that's going to be the religion of the people. So the group most active in this is known as the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, which is founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540. They become the religious order most active in trying to take back the minds of the people in Europe, particularly the aristocracy. As I said, the most famous one in some of the Germans' land, his name was Peter Canisius. There was also a really important church council called the Council of Trent, and it reaffirmed the church's position on all the sacraments, the nature of faith, salvation, providence, original sin, the veneration of the saints, the nature of the Mass, and its conclusions are known as the Tridentine Decrees. So the Council of Trent met between 1545 and 1563, not all during that time period, different subsets. I think it was 1545 to 46, and then 51 to 52, and then 63 to 64. But during that time, they debated and really they completely rejected Luther's idea of doctrine of justification by grace through faith. They were very clear about that. They would not have anything to do with the Protestant understanding of the church. They rejected Protestant ecclesiology and soteriology, theory of salvation, out of hand. They wanted nothing to do with it. During this time, some of the popes during this period also are responding to the new technology, the printing press, with an index of prohibited books, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. And we have to remember, like, they didn't know that. I mean, think about it this way, like, how do you deal with all of these new books that are flooding the marketplace? I mean, printers, this is like the original, like, the printers during this time, they are driving so much of what's going on. I mean, Martin Luther just posted these 95 Theses. The printer guy's like, hey, let's make a copy of that, spread this around. That's how Luther became a sensation across Europe. And, German, quasi-nationalists are claiming Luther's for us against, the people who want to take money out of Germany. That's how Luther actually originally made his name, because people thought he was standing up for German interests against, quasi-Italian interests in Rome. And this was all out of the indulgence controversy. So the printing press is changing the way religious people think about, material and people's access to it. So I think it's Paul III, I believe, wants to prohibit people's access to books that could take them away from the true faith. So we have the index of prohibited books. So the Reformation continues into the late 16th century, but you also get the rise of what we call the wars of religion. Now, the wars of religion are not just wars of religion. These aren't just wars that are only about religion. There's politics and economics involved. There's a lot of different factors. So I'm painting with very broad strokes here. You cannot say the 30 Years' War was all about religion. You cannot say the English Civil War was all about religion. You cannot say that any of these things were all about religion. But there is an element here in their political interests intertwined with religious interests, okay? So there were efforts to contain the violence of that was happening with the Reformation. The Anabaptists were not receiving any of that help. They were persecuted. This was also the beginning of what we call the witch craze in Europe at the time. But there was a settlement of Augsburg, a city in Bavaria, Germany, in 1555, and the Latin is Quios regio eos religio, which translated means whose realm, his religion. And this means that the faith of the rulers determined the faith of the people who lived in that part of the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire, remember, it's not Germany. This is a whole bunch of different principalities, all, with different local lords. And this is actually this arrangement actually favored the spread of Luther's evangelical, or Lutheranism, as we later come to call it, actually favored this. But what you have here is now people are starting to fight, and religion is becoming a major component of what they're fighting about. So let me list some wars here. There's the French Wars of Religion. There's the French Protestants, the Huguenots, okay, 1562 to 1598. There's the Dutch Revolt against Spain, okay, 1568 to 1648. I may be wrong about that date there. There's the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. That one I know. And that one actually breaks out in Bohemia, by the way. There's the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. And there are some smaller wars that bleed into the early 18th century. So you have some of the earliest proto-Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinkers born during this time period. René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679. And John Locke, 1632 to 1704. So you have people being born in a time period where there's a lot of violence. The 30 Years' War, I mean, I was reading a little bit about this today just to refresh myself. The 30 Years' War, like, devastated many, many parts of Germany, the German lands where this was fought. Like, it devastated these areas. And there's this creeping sort of movement where people are beginning to think that maybe we should not be fighting over religion. And the wars of religion end up leading to some changes. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I do want to talk about, I do want to talk about this with the early modern trends that take us to about 1687 or so. That's the publication of the Principia of Newton, which some people regard as the beginning of the Enlightenment. So, in the wake of the many wars of religion and the Peace of Westphalia, at the end of the 30 Years' War, Christian groups had to find new strategies for promoting their beliefs. Now, people are subject to their rulers first and not to the religion. So this is a bit of a change here from the Peace of Augsburg. Now you've got basically like, okay, this is what it is, right? But the political authority is what matters here, right? So remember that shift I said between spiritual to now we're firmly ensconced in the political era. This is the shift from spiritual to secular power. Many parts of Europe remained either Catholic or Protestant, with minority groups such as Anabaptists, Baptists, Puritan Congregationalists. England is Anglican. The English Reformation went a completely different direction than the rest of Europe. I didn't really talk about it, but it was basically a political divide, less so than religious, but the religious changes were certainly there as well. Henry VIII wanted a divorce. The Pope wouldn't let him do it, so he decided to become the head of his own church. Incredibly ironic, because Henry VIII actually was seen as a defender of the church early on against Luther. But he decided to take the English church, the Anglican church, in that direction. And, of course, we're well aware of his famous daughter by Anne Boleyn, Queen Elizabeth I. All right. So the Holy Roman Empire is a mix of Protestant and Catholic principalities. Spain is Catholic. The Italian states are Catholic. There is no Italy at this point either. Some people decide that in order to have religious freedom, they're going to move. They're going to travel to different parts of the world. And guess what? The New World is open for colonization. So some leave Europe and go to places in these colonies where they can establish their own religions and try to have a way of life that way. So, for example, Pennsylvania William Penn was a famous Quaker. Rhode Island, Baptist. Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritan Congregationalists. Virginia, Anglican. So you've got Maryland is Catholic, in fact. So you've got these kind of identifications of groups of people who are going to try to find places where they can freely worship their religion without any kind of persecution. Or and persecution is, we're at the point where people are not necessarily being killed for their beliefs anymore, but there's penalties, imprisonment. There's a lot of social pressure. I did a book review on a book about the Puritan divines and the social pressures that came with making sure you were on the right side of the Anglican Church with respect to your belief systems. And so there's a lot of pressure to conform to the dominant religion. Some of the Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers, in fact, would just not really have much to say. They did not want to be known to be, de facto atheist, because it's still kind of dangerous in those times. So let's talk about the Age of Enlightenment next, in fact. So that leads right into it. This is an intellectual movement characterized by a turn away from supernatural forms of authority to individual forms of authority based on reason and experience, rationalism and empiricism. So The Enlightenment built upon the emerging scientific revolution from the 1600s. It is dated roughly to the publication of Newton's Principia Mathematica in 1687. I tend to date it to Locke's Letter of Toleration in 1689. In that letter, Locke presents the idea that people of different religions can coexist within a state as long as the rule of law is followed, remember the secular authority, politics, with respect to harming a person or property. So do no harm to person or property. There's that famous example that I like to give in this course at I believe in the second week when I talk about Locke's contribution here. And it's fundamental because what he's saying is that you can be whatever you want to be, but as long as it doesn't go against the body politic or someone's person or property, that's okay. But if it does, then the state has to step in and you can't do that. So this is the beginning of the split here between church and state. Hobbes was fascinating. He had a slightly different idea. I don't want to go into that, but they are different on this as much as people think they're the same. They're actually pretty different. There's a lot of diversity of thought in the Enlightenment. I can't do justice to it. I can't talk about Rousseau, the noble savage, or Montesquieu, Voltaire, one of my favorites, David Hume, probably one of my favorite philosophers of all time, Scottish common sense. There's a lot going on. There's a diversity of thought, but there's certain key principles that emerge. First of all, people are looking at the universe as one operating by laws. Remember, this is the rise of deism as well. And humanity's job is to explore nature and to try to figure out what's going on in the world for human reasons, in human terms. Okay, so human reason and individual authority, individual reason is supplanting the idea of corporate supernatural authority. So we have basically the idea of Christendom and theocratic pretensions are gone now throughout most of Europe. You have governments that are to be followed not because they're of a particular religion, but because they are, governing. They are in charge. This is the age of the divine right of kings, where, now you've got arguments about kings having power from God, and it's not necessarily coming from the Pope, right? The popes are beginning to decrease in power during this time period. We are well beyond the age of the super powerful popes of the High and Late Middle Ages. Those days are gone. So we have many eras of Enlightenment thought moving out of the 18th century into the 19th century. For example, like Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein, the people in the mid-19th century development of historical criticism, interpretation of the Bible with a historical lens. Like all of these people are heirs of the Enlightenment period. So the picture here I have is of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. It's one of the most influential works on economics. It's a classic Enlightenment document. Really, the first person to really respond to it, and the idea of, I believe, supply-side economics. I'm not an economic historian at all, but I believe it was John Maynard Keynes who's coming into the 1920s and 30s with, a completely economic theory that's, similar principles but different ideas about how the economy works, responding to Adam Smith in classical economics. So very, very important document there. So the Enlightenment period is really about reason. Okay, it's the age of enlightenment. It's about reason. The Romantic period represents kind of a shift or a development, different scholars see it in different ways, of this focus on reason. And some people see it as the idea that, let's get back to what's wondrous and intense and feeling, and let's get back to the supernatural in a new way. Like, this is the era of Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, Edgar Allan Poe, this idea of bringing the supernatural back in literature and bringing the wonder back, the exploration and appreciation of nature, not just as something to be conquered and to be understood scientifically in a mechanical way. And I want to talk about Friedrich Schleiermacher, who is, he's 1768 to 1834. He's considered the father of modern liberal theology, and his theology is largely a rejection of Enlightenment rationalism. The deist clockmaker God is way too far removed from human experience for someone like Schleiermacher. And at the same time, these new nation states of Europe and the brand new United States at this point, they also reject this medieval theocracy. You don't have this, immanent God who is also transcendent anymore. There's like the Enlightenment gods, there's not much there, and Schleiermacher does not like that at all. So in his On Religion, Speeches to its culture despisers, he talks about religion as a feeling, a sense of dependence upon God. It is the expression of our connectedness to the world through this dependence upon the Creator. A later liberal theologian, Paul Tillich, would talk about this as ultimate concern. This is an internal mechanism. This is not external. It's not bound to proof. It's important. So this is our personal relationship. Our experience cannot be proven in that way. And as such, subjective experience triumphs over objective rationality. So now you've got, well, this is my experience, and this has value to me, and it doesn't necessarily make sense in rationality in these terms, but this is my faith, and this is the expression of my faith. Christianity slowly transitions from being largely the communal experience of a society. Pre-modern world, it's all about the group. It's not about you. There's no selfie sticks and none of that stuff. None of that. That is completely foreign to the pre-modern way of thinking. The modern way of thinking is about the individual. We're very much heirs of the Enlightenment in that sense. But the communal experience of a society, that's a pre-modern way of approaching religion. Shared experience of like-minded believers who have a personal experience and decide to come together because they share that experience and that desire to experience things together. That's a modern way of approaching and being part of a religious community. It's less an expression of a community, and it's more of an expression of an individual within that community, and they're like-minded, and they're not necessarily together because they have to be or that's just the way it is. It's because they choose to be. Okay? And this paves the way to what is called denominationalism in modern nation states. And this is the relegation of religion to a sphere of human experience. I've talked about this in my classes before about how the contemporary mind is often fractured. Like you're a different person in one realm of your life than you are in another. This is completely foreign to the pre-modern mind. The pre-modern person is the same all the time, everywhere. It makes no sense to be anything different because that is your relationship to the divine. Depends upon this transparency and sameness, really. And shifting between identities doesn't make a lot of sense to the pre-modern mind. First of all, it's not a way to stay safe in those societies and communities, especially if your word is your bond. I mean, I've looked at oaths and the importance of oaths and why oaths matter so much in the pre-modern world. It's because the world is held together by your word. It's your bond, right? Going back on your word is a major, major issue in the pre-modern world. Examples of this turn to the subjective experience. The first and second Great Awakenings. The first Great Awakening, 1730s, 1740s. And, of course, we have the work of George Whitefield and John Wesley, Jonathan Edwards. And the second Great Awakening, 1790 to 1840, are evidence of this shift to a more personal, visceral experience of religion. I find the second Great Awakening far more fascinating, interesting than the first Great Awakening. I'm sorry, I just do. This is the time when you have Joseph Smith and the Burned Over District, and you've got a lot of stuff going on in the second Great Awakening that I just find incredibly fascinating. Oh, the Anxious Bench. Finney, the Anxious Bench. Like, literally the idea of people going up and, like, being called and being converted on the spot. Like, sitting on the bench and, like, the preacher is talking to you, and you are, inspired to convert, to become a true believer. Like, that is an amazing transition to Christianity as a really personal, visceral, lived moment of experience. So let's talk about denominationalism. Today, there's a wide variety of doctrines and practices among Christian groups in many parts of the world. For me to be able to explain and talk about all of those would be impossible. I'm finding this presentation next to impossible. So you've got the areas of the world where you had a lot of the colonial influence. The British Empire was said that the sun never set on the British Empire because there were colonies all over the world, and of course there were many, many negative implications of the colonial influences of these places. But in those places that have forms of government that are representative in that fashion, very much like Great Britain or the United States today, there you do have something akin to denominationalism. The idea that people believe and are part of groups of like-minded believers, and it's not the state has a religion that they absolutely everybody has to belong to, or most people have to belong to. It's not like the theocracies of the Middle Ages. So that is denominationalism in the world today. However, denominationalism is a product of the Enlightenment distinction between church and state, and it was grudgingly accepted in practice during the modern period from 1792 to now. We oftentimes think, oh, this is great, but that was grudgingly accepted. It wasn't like this was something that everybody thought was great. In fact, it wasn't, because this goes against everybody's previous experience before. Before, that's not the way it was, and now it is. So this is something that people grudgingly, especially in the churches who are now subject to the political authorities, grudgingly submit to. It is also not a feature of religion in certain parts of the world that reject modern forms of secular government and do have something that's more close to what we would call a theocracy in different parts of the world today. So we cannot say that denominationalism as this model, this Enlightenment model, or post-Enlightenment model is global. It's not necessarily global. We cannot just assume that just because something is in one part of the world that it's in another part of the world. It's a big world out there. The dominant branches of Christianity in the world are Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and then under the big umbrella of Protestantism, you have many, many different groups. So there's a lot of different groups within Christianity. Those are what I consider the three main branches. I didn't even talk about the ancient Assyrians or the ancient Syriac church, the ancient Coptic church. I'm terribly sorry about that. I should have done that last week too, but I didn't. Yeah, I mean, I've got the early Christian church. I've got this little slide on the next one. The Roman Catholic Church, the Monophysites, the Eastern Orthodoxy. There's the Anglican, the Lutherans, the Reformed, Anabaptists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Episcopalians, Methodists. Church of the Nazarene, Church of God in Christ, UCC. There are tons and tons and tons of churches that aren't even on this little chart that I gave you. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to different variants of religion. And for example, I come from the Lutheran tradition. On the slide previous, you had a picture of the church where my father grew up in Waymansville, Indiana. And that Lutheran church, I was raised in the Missouri Synod, but there are other branches of the Lutheran Church in America. So you have, I believe, the Wisconsin Synod. You also have the ELCA. So you've got a lot of different variants within, even ones that you think are just what they are. Lutherans. Oh, yeah, well, they're all Lutherans. Well, no, that's not exactly true. There are lots of different Lutherans out there. Trust me, I know. All right, so let's talk about some trends in modernity. So what are some of the larger trends in modern Christianity? So one of them is ecumenism. So during the late 19th and early 20th century, many Christian groups sought ways to heal divides and cooperate with each other. For example, in 1965, both the Catholics and the Orthodox revoked the excommunications that they had, given each other during the schism, the Great Schism of 1054. So you've got this movement of people trying to come back together. There's also the idea of the notion of engagement with the world. So the Catholic Church, long suspicious of modern science and the advent of modern historical criticism with textual interpretation of the Bible, re-engaged the world at the Second Vatican Council. The televangelism of the 20th century, continuing today, especially in some of the megachurches, represents engagement with new technologies to reach new audience and make new converts. This is an important element of the 20th century. The rise of televangelism is an incredibly interesting part of the Christian story in the 20th century. I've got a picture there of Billy Graham, lived to be 99 years old. He was a televangelist and spiritual advisor from nearly every president, I believe, from Truman to Obama. I read that he was particularly close to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Graham inspired a generation of Christian evangelicals and televangelists in the United States. So you've got this idea of engagement with the world, and that's also tied into the notion of interpretation. Interpretation of text is a huge issue. We talked about this with Judaism. How do you interpret the Torah? Orthodox, Hasidic, and then conservative in the middle, and then Reform. There's a lot going on there. Same thing within Christianity. So while many Christian denominations practice more liberal interpretations of the Bible and embrace the challenges of the 21st century in areas like social justice, gender relations, homosexuality, environment, other pressing concerns, economic injustice, all of these issues that are contemporary today. Many Christian groups engage those in ways with their interpretation of Scripture, and others pursue a more literal interpretation of Scripture and pursue it in their ways as well. And they oftentimes come to conflicting interpretations of what that means. What should the church's relationship or the Christian's relationship with those certain things be? Like, should women be allowed to be pastors or preachers or ministers? Like, that's a big question that many Protestant denominations went one direction and others did not. The Catholic Church does not have women priests. The other one is a married priesthood. For example, in the Orthodox Church, you could be a married priest, but if you reach a certain level, you can't be a bishop. And in the Roman Catholic Church, you have to be celibate. So there's all of these sort of ideas like marriage, gender relations, like all of that stuff. Like, how do we deal with all of these modern concerns? And different churches interpret Scripture in different ways. Some people might call it a canon within a canon, where you have a subset of texts that you really hold on to within the Scriptures to interpret the Bible. A lot of people accuse Luther of that, but everybody does it. Everybody has a certain subset of texts that they go to justify their practice of a religion, and that is definitely the case within Christianity as in any other religion. Yeah, like I said, like in Judaism, there is a spectrum of conservative and liberal thought. This goes for all religions. You've got different people who have different approaches to the religion. So there you have it. Christianity as a religion is particularly fascinating to me. I find it's the connection to the Enlightenment and the fallout after the Enlightenment with respect to how Christianity sort of adapted. Schleiermacher looms large here. The idea of the subjective turn within Christianity is really, really important. I, of course, full disclosure, I studied the Reformation quite a bit. I was a really big fan of Martin Luther back in the day, studying Doctrine of Justification and looking at his rejection of the Catholic penitential process and system. I did not do that justice today at all. In fact, I probably messed it up more than I made sense of it, but I'm trying to give you the broad strokes here. I am trying to give you a vision of what the importance of Christianity within world religions. And of course, I did have to do that within a particular subset. I cannot talk about, I do not know much about the Orthodox Church and what happened in the Greek world, Byzantine moving forward. I don't know a lot about some of the more contemporary movements, a fusion of Christianity with other religions and other faiths. I did not even talk about slave religion in the United States. I did not even talk about movements that began in rejection of colonial influences like Rastafarianism. There's just a lot that I did not get to. But I hope to have given you some broad strokes of how we got from the patristic period with Christianity to today through the centuries, roughly about 500 until now. So with that being said, I'll let you go. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.